Okay, good evening, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. My name is Kathy Kuhn. I'm the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. I'm so pleased to welcome you all here to the very first session in our learning series, which is focused on vacant and abandoned properties. Just for anyone who may not be familiar with the Metropolitan Housing Coalition, we are a coalition of over 300 individual and organizational members who have been working on issues of fair and affordable and accessible housing in Louisville for over 30 years. As some of you may know, as a part of this work, the Metropolitan Housing Coalition has for many years been leading a public forum known as the Louisville Vacant and Abandoned Properties campaign. And during this time, the campaign has led advocacy efforts on a variety of issues that impact vacant and abandoned properties in Louisville, including things like funding for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and the Louisville Land Bank, and advocating for needed reforms to the Land Development Code, looking at issues associated with property taxes, and among many other issues. And, while a lot has certainly changed over that time, it's also true that many neighborhoods in the city continue to be plagued by vacant and abandoned properties. And we know that these vacant and abandoned properties can have a whole host of negative impacts, including, increased crime, further neighborhood disinvestment, and environmental hazards and health concerns, among other well-documented consequences. So the Vacant and Abandoned Properties campaign thought that, this might be a really good time to just kind of reset, get a sense as to, what progress has been made and what more we might be able to be doing. So that's really why we have initiated this learning series, in which we're going to be covering a wide range of topics related to vacant and abandoned properties, including code enforcement and compliance, community tools that are in existence to help with vacant and abandoned properties, such as the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and Community Land Trust. We're going to look at how we can help people to age in place and prevent vacant and abandoned properties. And we're going to look at what we might be able to learn from other communities that could inform our strategies here in Louisville. So we're going to share more information in the chat about the upcoming learning sessions so that you can save the dates for those. But I want to just mention that tonight our session is focused on the role of the city in addressing vacant and abandoned properties. And we're going to try and get a better sense as to what the city, can do and is doing to address these issues. And hopefully we can begin to think about ways that we can strengthen the impact of our work in preventing and addressing vacant and abandoned properties. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. This is a webinar format, and we are certainly going to have time for questions before we end the session tonight. So please put your comments and your questions in the chat box or in the Q&A thread. And my partner, Tony Curtis, and I are going to be curating all the questions, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. So with that, I am going to introduce our presenter for tonight, who is a person that no doubt many of you probably know. Laura Grabowski is currently the Director of the Office of Community Development within Develop Louisville. She has over 14 years of experience working on issues related to safe housing in Louisville. She has a bachelor's degree in political science and government from Indiana University Southeast and a master's degree in urban affairs and public policy from the University of Delaware. So Laura, I want to thank you for being here with us tonight to share your insight and your expertise. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. Can everybody hear me? Or I guess, thank you. Good. It's always good to check. Thanks for having me tonight. I think this is a great series. I'm really looking forward to tonight's session and the sessions remaining in the year. I hope everybody enjoys it. When Kathy and Tony and other people that have been attending the Vacant Properties campaign meetings, when we started talking about what could be done, what we wanted to do with this series, I thought it might be a good idea to start with kind of a level set on vacant and abandoned properties, using our office as a little bit of, not the guinea pig necessarily, but we get I don't know, somewhere between 300 and 500 calls a week from people, from community members interested in vacant properties, whether they're interested in purchasing a property, whether they're wanting to register a complaint about a property. A lot of people just want to know what's happening with a particular property. So we thought for this first session, let's start high level and big picture, and let's talk a little bit about vacant and abandoned properties inside of Louisville. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen. I've got a little presentation for everybody. Let's see. Okay. And Kathy, if you could give me a thumbs up if you see. Good. Okay, great. Okay. So let's see here. How do I get to the next slide? There we go. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see this. Before we start talking about the city's role in vacant and abandoned properties, I think the question I get asked the most is how many properties, how many VAPs, how many vacant and abandoned properties do we have? And everyone from, news reporters, community members, neighborhood leaders, the mayor himself asks the same question. And I wish that there was an easy answer, but with just like a lot of, city issues, and it's complex, right? There's not a simple answer. So I wanted to show you some pictures quickly, and this would be easier if we were of course, in person. But if you take a look at the property on the left here, and you're walking down the street and you see this house, you don't see any boards on the windows or the door. It could be vacant, it could be occupied. The grass looks cut. The picture might have been taken in the spring before the grass started growing. And then if you look at the picture on the right, you see 3 houses in a row with boards on them. Generally when people are asking how many vacant properties do we have in Louisville, and we share this number of 5,000, 3,000, 8,000. Whenever I have a chance to ask the follow-up question is, what is your view of a vacant and abandoned property? Most people think about these houses on the right, with the boards on the windows and doors, people getting in, animals getting in, potentially fire starting. Definitely not something that you want to live next to, that you want your children walking in front of to go to school. This is not the sign of a healthy block. But as far as the city is concerned, both of these properties end up on what we would consider our vacant property list. And that is because when a call comes in or a complaint comes in to 311 and code enforcement officers go into the neighborhood to check on them, they will note whether they think a property is vacant or not. And in this case, both of these pictures show a property that code enforcement has marked as vacant. So if you're looking at the bottom of the slide where it says vacant ? The answer to both would be yes. But the second question is very important when we're deciding what type of strategies the city can use to help resolve vacant and abandoned properties. And the second question is, are these presumed to be abandoned, or are they abandoned? And if we dig a little bit deeper, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, if we dig a little bit deeper, what we'll find is that the one on the left actually has an owner. The owner responds when code enforcement sends a citation. The ones on the right don't. So that's important, because the property on the left and the property on the right are both included in that number that people generally talk about when we talk about the city having 5,000 vacant properties. It includes the house on the left, the houses on the right, and it also includes vacant lots. But we as the city do not view all of those equally. But it does explain why the answer to the question of how many VAPs do we have gets to be complex. So let's talk a little bit more about that. These are just some bullet points of vacant versus what we would call presumed abandoned. I think everybody knows that, we don't live in one of these futuristic sci-fi movies where every house and every person is tracked in some way. So that's the other thing, is whenever we are asked, how many vacant properties, how many abandoned properties there are, it's that number changes, and we are using data to inform our information about properties, but it's not as if the property lights up in red whenever it's finally abandoned. So if you look at the list on the left for a vacant property, you may be able to tell that a property is vacant. The vacant property might be a problem. It might have an owner that is taking care of the property where it's just vacant. Maybe it's between tenants. It's a landlord that, a tenant moved out and they're waiting for a new tenant to move in. Maybe somebody's trying to sell their house. Maybe an elderly person has gone to live with a relative or in a nursing home, or maybe somebody's passed away and the will hasn't been through the court process yet. There are a lot of reasons for properties to be vacant. They're not all problematic. And, from the city's perspective, if the property is being kept up, if it's being maintained and we're not getting complaints about it, we may or may not actually know that it's vacant. On the other side, though, we have vacant and presumed abandoned. The properties are definitely going to be vacant, but this is where the city starts understanding and starts doing a little bit more research into the property. So the grass is growing and it's not being cut. Maybe there's an opening that it needs to be boarded. The taxes aren't being paid. And when code enforcement or codes and regs is sending a citation, the owner is not responding to it. Sometimes in these houses, there may be people interested in purchasing the house, but they can't find an owner. And so I think that's just really important for everybody to remember, is that abandoned truly does mean abandoned. If something is abandoned, there's not an owner to be found for a variety of reasons. It could be that the person has passed away, there are no heirs. It could be that a corporation was dissolved. It could be that the person lives somewhere else and isn't responding. There's a variety of reasons why people might walk away from a property, but that's the real difference. And so why is this important, and why am I spending a lot of time on this? It's important because the city generally has strategies to deal with both vacant properties that are problematic and abandoned properties that are problematic. But depending on the property, is how we determine what strategy to use. There's some questions that we generally ask. How do we know that they're vacant and abandoned? Like we talked about, there's not a red light on the top of the house that says, okay, now it's abandoned, city, you need to come in and do something. Okay, we're getting complaints on the property. The code enforcement officer is going out and inspecting and sending citations. Maybe an owner is responding, maybe it's not. The postal service marks properties as vacant. Sometimes that's a problem, and sometimes it's not. Are there open code violations? Does the owner have a different tax mailing address? A lot of times, if we are working with a property that is vacant or is abandoned, potentially even has a need to be demolished, and we're looking up the tax bill, the property's tax bill, a lot of times will go to the same address as the property, and we know it's obvious nobody is living there. So that's problematic. We need to, as homeowners, we need to keep up our tax bill mailing address with the PVA and the sheriff. Does the city have the correct address? I mean, if we basically, what we're doing is we're using that tax bill mailing address as the official address. If there are lien holders on properties, sometimes they are registering so that the city knows that there are other people with interest in the property. Sometimes the city's doing research on its own to try to find the owners. Are the taxes paid? Is the property, does somebody else have it in foreclosure? And our biggest indicator of abandonment is, are we, the city, sending out crews to cut the grass, clean up dumping, and board the property? And when that's happening, of course, before we do that, we're sending a notice to the owner. And if we're not getting a response, that's really when we decide not we decide, but when we can tell that it's, for the most part, it's probably an abandoned property. So now, with all of that set to set the stage, I'll go ahead and talk about some numbers. So we talked earlier, vacant properties, abandoned properties. We also have the difference between buildings and lots. I know that many people live in neighborhoods where there are boarded up houses, concentrations of those, and those are the properties that the city really wants to focus on. It doesn't mean that we don't focus on vacant lots, but it does mean that with limited resources, we are going to focus our targets. We're going to target the abandoned structure. So these numbers have to do with buildings and not lots. So how many vacant buildings exist? This 3,500 number came from codes and regs inspections late last fall. And these are properties that the code inspector has marked as vacant, and that means that from their best inspection, they can tell that the property is vacant and that the property has code violations. Because as we talked about, I think the Postal Service has lists maybe 8,000 vacant buildings in Louisville, but not all of those are problems. Some of those are, commercial structures that don't have a tenant, or residential structures that are being sold, or empty apartment units. There's a lot of reasons for vacancy, but we want to know when the vacant buildings are a problem. Within that 3,500 number, when we talk about codes and regs actually sending crews out to board houses, cut grass, and clean up dumping, we're talking about around 1,000. So, and that's a lot less than when we talk about, a lot of times you will hear in the news media and even from us, we talk about 5,000 to 8,000 vacant properties. And though there is some truth to that when you put lots in and when you talk about vacant and abandoned, and of course it goes up and down throughout the years, but those are generally what we want to focus on are the buildings. How many buildings are controlled by the city? I'm chuckling only because this is probably the biggest myth out there. We still get asked this question at least, I don't know, 50 times a week. We own probably 40 to 50 buildings at a time. We tend to cycle them in and out pretty quickly. We do not own, 3,500 buildings. We don't own a lot of buildings. We don't own very many. Where are they concentrated? This is not a surprise to anybody. Those vacant and abandoned buildings are concentrated in the western neighborhoods, and that is really part of our goal, is to decrease those concentrations. So, take a drink for a second here. What are our goals? We want to see vacant and abandoned properties occupied. We want the same thing that the neighbors do. We want them occupied. We want them well maintained by the owner, whether that's a landlord or an owner occupant. We would like it to be tax producing if it can. If it's owned by nonprofits, that's a different story. That's not our top goal. We really want to target the areas that have the high concentrations of abandoned structures. Obviously we want healthier and safer neighborhoods and neighbors. And of course, we would like to spend less city dollars on vacant property maintenance. That would be awesome. So when we put all of those together and we think about our abandoned structure number and the data that we use to figure out whether structures are abandoned, that's where we get to, I think, part of the point of tonight's session, which is what are our strategies? What are the city strategies to deal with these properties? This is a big slide. It has a lot of words, but I thought it was better so that you could see it in one place. I think another question that we get asked a lot has to do with our strategies. I think it's pretty complicated. There are a lot of legal structures around what the city can and can't do, and they're there for good reason. So one of our questions we get frequently is, why can't the city just take the property? It's abandoned, take it. And in certain states that is an option. In our state, that's not an option. So this is pretty much the list of strategies that we have to deal with properties that are vacant or abandoned. And the top set of strategies are handled by codes and regs, or the Office of Management and Budget. The blue is actually handled by our Office of Community Development, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. I will urge you to tune in to the next session, which I believe is in April. There will be someone from Codes and Regs there to talk a little bit more about about how they play in. Generally speaking, Codes and Regs, their code officers are out inspecting properties based on complaints. Our office gets involved with the truly abandoned properties. That's sort of the differentiation between us. So that's why when you as a neighbor are calling 311 to report a vacant property, that doesn't go to our office quite yet. It starts in Codes and Regs. But if that property remains vacant for a long time, if it becomes a real problem property, that's when it gets transferred over, and we take a look at our strategy. So just starting at the top, I think it's really helpful for people to think about this in a structure for what is the goal. I mean, if you're a neighbor and you're living next to a property and the grass is 3 feet high and you're worried about rodents, you want that grass cut, and you want it cut quickly, and you want it cut probably permanently. But when the city receives complaints and comes out to cut the grass or pick up the tires or the mattresses or board up the openings, those properties they might be abandoned, they might not be abandoned. They might just be, there might be an owner that for whatever reason is unable or unwilling to take care of the property. So in that scenario, the city's strategy is abate the nuisance, right? It's cut the grass, clean up the dumping. That doesn't do anything about the ownership. And that's why there's a column here about ownership change. It's really important, I think, for people to remember and just to understand what happens when that happens. So say the city crews come out, they cut the grass. Well, grass continues to grow, right? So in another, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 week, depending on the summer that we would have, that grass is going to come back. And if that owner hasn't responded, then it's just going to continue to be a problem. Okay, Codes and Regs also, based on the citations that they're sending, has options to take owners to court. And like I said, in April, they will talk way more about that. But generally speaking, again, is this property abandoned? No, because they're serving somebody, or they're someone is responding and showing up. So the idea here is to urge the owner to bring that property into compliance. It's to say, hey, this is sort of the stick approach, right? To say, please get the property back into compliance so the city can stop citing. The next two strategies in here are run by our Office of Management and Budget, and they are, as the name implies, interested in collecting money. So every time that the city is sending crews out to do something relating to boarding, cutting, we're spending taxpayer dollars on that. So the Office of Management and Budget is very interested in getting the city reimbursed for those expenses. So they will file potentially a civil collection suit. And that the idea again would be to urge that owner to bring the property into compliance themselves and to reimburse the city for expenses. Does that change the ownership? No, still owned by the same owner. Sometimes, though, they will accept applications for a lien reduction or waiver. Those are based on the code enforcement liens. And this happens frequently where the owner a great example of this is someone's inherited a property, didn't realize that it was a problematic property until some of the city had cut the grass or boarded a couple of times, and the person who's inherited it either wants to keep it for themselves or wants to sell it. So the Office of Management and Budget has a process that they will accept applications to reduce or waive those liens. And a lot of times that'll happen just so the property can be transferred. So the ownership change in here, it's certainly not required, but it is certainly possible. So the last four here in blue are really managed by our office, and these have to do mostly with abandoned property. And these are some of the strategies that we use on what we would consider, truly blighted properties, or really the worst of the worst properties. And you can see here, we've got, we do take donations to the land bank. Obviously, those aren't abandoned because an owner has shown up. A lot of times it does happen where an owner will have inherited the property and they're not interested in it. They just want to get it, get it out of their name. The great thing about the land bank is that when properties come in with some legal limitations, it does generally clean that title, and that means that the land bank can help get that property back out to productive use. Same thing with foreclosure. It does clean the title, whether the property is purchased at commissioner's sale by someone else or by the land bank. There is at least a chance for that property to return back to productive use. Demolition, I will say this a couple of times today. When the city demolishes a house, we do not own the property. The city does not own the property when it demolishes a house. The city demolishes a house if there's a structural issue, if it's an emergency demo, if it's a health and safety hazard, or if there are structural issues and it's a property maintenance issue. But either way, the city does not take ownership of it. The city will tear it down, and a lien will go on the property. And then, of course, we have the land bank sales. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. So just a little bit more information about the strategies that our office handles, and just to highlight this, pretty much everything that the city does relating to vacant and abandoned properties does cost something. So when we're foreclosing on vacant and presumed abandoned properties, it's costing the city around $4,000 to $6,000 per action. And that's why we tend to want to target structures rather than lots, and we want to try to get into an area that has a high concentration of those donations. If we're approached by people who want to donate property, that obviously takes a lot less time and costs a lot less. And then, like I said, again, demolition, it costs the city a lot of money. We're obviously trying to get the owner to do something first before the city will step in and demolish it. But when we do that, it does not change the ownership. The city does not own the property once it demolishes it, just because it demolishes it. The land bank, just to highlight this a little bit, and then I'll have a little bit more information at the end for some more information if you are interested in learning more about the land bank and its programs. But I think a lot of people think that the land bank is the city, and that's partially true. It's the partnership between the city, JCPS, and the Commonwealth of Kentucky. It was set up in the late 80s. I think it's the second or third oldest in the country. And the idea here is that the main taxing entities get together, and they are interested, of course, in taking abandoned properties and putting them back into a tax producing status. So as I said earlier, the land bank only controls about 40 to 50 structures, but it does own about 500 parcels. Most of those are vacant lots. And we do have a variety of different policies that we sell buildings and lots through. I didn't want to leave the strategy discussion before talking a little bit about some initiatives that we have going on this year. One of which is at the General Assembly. We're pretty excited about this. It's Senate Bill 105. It's a conservatorship bill, and it was actually going to be heard in committee tomorrow, but the snow has delayed it, so I think it'll be heard next week. The idea here is, I guess it's a little bit similar to when you have a child or somebody who can't take care of themselves and the court appoints a guardian. It's a little bit like that, but for houses instead. So whereas a foreclosure legal action, it goes through the process of giving everyone notice, all the potentially interested parties, and then at the end it goes to sale. In a conservatorship bill, it actually takes the property, and while it's still technically owned by the owner, it says, we can appoint a conservator, which is somebody who has some knowledge of how to rehab houses, and that entity can rehab the structure. So this will really be, if we can get this passed, I think it will really be an additional tool that we can add to the strategies that we already have. It's not going to be useful in every situation. It would be useful, I think, in our neighborhoods with historic structures, where when we have to wait until the foreclosure goes all the way through and someone else owns it to start fixing it, this will allow us to get into the property a little bit sooner, hopefully a lot sooner, and make some changes to the property. I think it'll help save some of our historic buildings. So take a watch or watch that Senate bill, and we'll see what happens with it. The other three initiatives that we have going on this year really focus on the land bank. The Metro Louisville has a racial equity toolkit that it's using now, and we are going through all of the land bank sales programs with that lens of the racial equity toolkit, just to see if there are any changes that can be made, if there are any changes that should be made, if there are any new programs that we should be having, that we should be launching to help really focus on racial equity. With that, we're also trying to increase our focus on home ownership, and we're undertaking a review with the help of some stakeholders of our vacant lot agricultural programs. We have a decent amount of interest in people who want to start gardens, especially considering the food deserts that a lot of our properties are located in. So those are just some of the strategies that we have going on. I think, with the rest of the time, and I want to make sure that there's a lot of time for questions, I just wanted to show a few. I'm a visual person, and I think it would help to just show a few properties from vacant and abandoned to repurposed, just to show some of the strategies that we use on a daily basis. So we'll start here. This property is in Russell, and this is an example of our single family rehabilitation and sale. This is probably the most common type of property sale that we do out of the land bank. So as you can see, in 2017, this property was donated to the land bank. The land bank has one of our programs is called the request for proposals. And so the land bank sells the house via that program. A buyer renovates it, takes about a year, and puts it up for sale. And within a year, the house looks much better, and a new buyer or an owner occupant is now living in it and enjoying this really nice house now in a gorgeous neighborhood. So like I said, this is a very popular thing that the land bank does, and that the city does with vacant properties, where there are a lot of people interested in purchasing the house, and they have the capacity and the knowledge to rehab it, and then they'll put it for sale. Another option that's really similar is for a buyer to purchase a vacant lot and then build on it. And in this case, you can see that the house was demolished in 2011. There was a foreclosure filed on 2016. It was obviously a vacant lot by then. The land bank acquires it the next year at the commissioner's sale, sells it to a nonprofit housing developer, and within a year they have a new house, and the new owner buys the house and moves in. So a brand new house. This one is in the Jacobs neighborhood. Sometimes we'd like it to happen more often than it does. Sometimes the land bank can sell directly to an owner occupant. As I think you can see with some of the pictures that are included in this presentation, most of our structures and buildings are in varying degrees of deteriorating shape, and they're quite a lot to rehab. But this one in Park Duval was a townhome, and the city did file a foreclosure on it. It had been vacant for quite a few years. The land bank acquired it at the commissioner's sale. We used that same program, the request for proposals, and an owner purchased it and wanted to rehab it for themselves and moved in. So that was a great success. We do have that happen sometimes. Like I said, it's not as often as we like, only because we need people with knowledge of how to deal with major rehab. Most of our properties are residential, but every once in a while we'll get a commercial property. This one's in Portland, and you can see the picture on the left of on the bottom where it was a historic structure. It's been around the Portland neighborhood for quite some time, but as you can see in the before picture, it had really gone, it had really deteriorated, and we were worried that it was going to have to be demolished, but we were able to file foreclosure on it, get it at commissioner's sale, and there was an owner interested. They bought it through, this is a different program called Last Look. It's where we put our demolition candidates, and people can come and basically save the structure, which these people did. And the owner rehabbed the commercial property, and they're going to be locating their business there. So this is the final example. This is a multifamily. Again, it's not often that we get something big, but if you notice, this is I don't even think we have a picture of the entire thing, but you can kind of see in the after. This is a 10-plex in Portland. It is set up as 10 one-bedroom units, and it had fires on both sides. So a foreclosure was filed. We acquired it at commissioner's sale. Because this was a large property, multifamily, that we don't get every day, we actually used a solicitation of interest to put it out. And the person who was interested in the buyer purchased it and rehabbed the property, and now they're renting this as affordable rental housing to veterans. So those are just some examples. We have a lot of properties that could fit into these types of sales. If you're interested in more, especially about the land bank and some of our strategies, this is the best. Our website, I think, is the best place to start. It has all of our available properties. It also has an explanation about all of our sales programs. If you go to the website, or when you go to the website, if you go to the left on the menu, there's a place that says subscribe. And when you click on that, put your email and or your cell phone number, and you will get email and texts about when new properties are available. I promise we won't spam you. It's maybe once, maybe twice a month, but that's the way. I think we have over 4,000 people on that list. That's the way people generally know that we have new properties, and we normally update our property list about once a month. So we've also recently, especially because of COVID, started a series of lunch and learns. They're done in the middle of the day, but they're all archived on our Develop Louisville Facebook page. And there's an entire hour about how to buy a land bank house. There's an entire hour about how to buy a land bank lot. There's an hour about how to do property research, which is great. We get a ton of questions about, what's going on with this property, or do you own X property? And there are lots of ways that people can do that research at home. And so that particular Lunch and Learn goes over that. And then we do have our monthly land bank meetings that are generally on the second Monday of each month, also on the Facebook page. And you can see the proposed projects. You can hear about, I want to buy this, I want to build new construction, I want to rehab it. You can kind of get an idea of the types of questions that the board asks. A lot of people who are interested in purchasing properties will watch a few land bank meetings just to know what they're getting themselves into. I think it's super important, and I know that codes and regs will tell you this too in April, but if you're a neighbor and you have a vacant property that you are concerned about, call 311. Or use the 311 app. It's the best way to let Metro know that property is a problem. If you think your neighbor's already called about it, that's okay. You call about it too. Sometimes everybody thinks that everyone else is calling, and in fact, people haven't called. And then, like I said, researching vacant properties is always helpful too. And we do have that lunch and learn about it. So with that, I think I'll stop and take a drink of water and see if I can, and see what kind of questions we have. I just want to highlight, we do have 2 phone numbers. That first one, the 4016 number, is our main number. That is what you would call if you're interested in vacant properties as a whole. Whether it's, you're interested in foreclosure, demolition, you want to report a vacant property that's not to 311, you want to ask about something, that's really reserved for that. The 4200 line is specifically for a land bank. So if you're interested in purchasing a property, that you're going to want to go straight to the 4200 line. So So with that, thank you all for listening to all of that. I know that was a lot. I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has.
Laura, thank you so much for that very comprehensive presentation. I really appreciated seeing some of the examples of the strategies at work because, as you clearly showed, it's obviously a very complicated process, but when it works, it can be really, really powerful. So I think it's important it was helpful to see how those strategies can work. So I'm glad that we left some good amount of time for questions because we have a ton. And so the first question that came in was, does the city check to see if properties are sound enough for rehab versus raising? And I guess if so, what does that process look like?
We absolutely do that. Yeah, one of our staff members, our office has a staff of 9, and one of those people is a building inspector. And so when the land bank gets properties in, whether through donation or acquisition at the commissioner's sale, that they are inspected and a determination is made. And that's when you might remember in the before and after pictures, there was a request for proposals program and a last look program, and that's how those are differentiated. So if it's in last look, it means we think it's a demolition candidate, but we don't want to demolish it until, I mean, we don't want to demolish it at all, but we certainly don't want to demolish it until we have to. And so we will make it available for people to try to save it. And we've had that program for about 3 years, and it's actually been pretty successful. There are quite a lot of people, we were surprised, that are interested in. We knew people wanted to save structures. Obviously, nobody wants to see old structures demolished, but to actually, have the wherewithal and to take the step to do it is different. But yeah, that's how that's done. So that inspection is done before it goes into the programs.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And so this is a question that I was actually wondering myself, is why do you think the impression exists that the city controls all of these properties, that they own, for that 4,000 abandoned properties?
That's a good question, and one that I'm not sure I can answer, but I do think that there is that across the country, different states have different laws, and there are states in which a property is 3 years tax delinquent and the state can take it in some manner. I mean, that's oversimplified, but I get the impression that people, maybe hear that on the national news, and think that that's how it works here. I think that the more that I get into this, the more I realize how absolutely complicated and complex real estate and property rights are. And I just think that when you're not in it every day, it's, you're seeing city crews come and cut the grass. I mean, it makes sense. Why wouldn't this, why would the city be cutting something they don't own? Right. We'd love not to do that, but there are some health and safety issues that we have to handle. So that's probably my best guess on that.
All right, great. So there's a question here around when a demolition has to happen. I'm assuming maybe this is associated with like an emergency demolition. The question is, does the owner get a bill for that when that happens?
Yeah, they do. They do. And especially, so when you think about demolitions, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but think emergency versus structural. In an emergency, the city building inspector is really saying this thing has to come down. It is an immediate safety hazard. And so with that, our staff doesn't have a lot of time really to move, but we always do attempt to find the owner, find phone numbers, find relatives, as much as we can, to let them know, because a lot of times not a lot of times, but sometimes the owner is around and they are aware, potentially they have insurance or something to that effect, and they will say, I'll take it down, don't do it, because of course if the city's going to take it down, it's going to be more expensive. That's just how things work. So and then on the other side, the structural, it's the same sort of thing happens, but there's just more time. So we're saying, look, it's, we've been citing, property maintenance has been citing you for a long time, and the place keeps deteriorating, we're getting to a point where we're going to have to demolish. But yeah, as soon as that happens and we don't hear back from the owner and we do take it down, a lien is placed on the property after a demand for payment is sent.
Okay, and there's a question here related to liens that's kind of asking, like, would liens that are placed on properties uproot people from their homes? And I guess I would sort of follow up with that by asking, in your opinion, is there a better process for getting land into reuse than using the foreclosure property process on liens?
Those are some good questions. So let me say a couple of things. Our office deals with vacant properties. I mean, we are generally not dealing with occupied property. So of course, the city, especially codes and regs, is citing people who own properties and live in properties, or own properties and have renters in properties. That's generally, except in very extreme circumstances, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with, a foreclosure on a property that's been vacant for years, sometimes a decade or more. And then, when we're foreclosing, of course, the attorneys are sending in notices to anybody that they can find that has any interest in the property. And what we do find is that it's extremely rare when anyone responds. Every once in a while we'll get, an heir that didn't know that they had the property, and that's sometimes when a foreclosure can turn into a donation. But we would. I guess the second part is we don't want to foreclose. We don't want to do that. That's not something that we want to do. But there aren't a lot of legal tools in the state to deal with abandoned properties. We don't have the kind of constitution or laws that would, turn over property when the property's been abandoned for some time and it's not been, taxes haven't been paid, or there's citations or whatever. So that's when we really do step in and file foreclosure, because that's really one of the only tools that we have. I will say, though, that when I mentioned the lien waiver and reduction process, that is something that I know. I mean, I know our office doesn't manage, but we do suggest that people who are in that situation, they don't want to keep the property. This, like I said, this isn't for people who are getting liens that they want to have their property, but if they've inherited a property or something to that effect, and the liens are more than, or they're just adding up and they're more than what the property is worth, it is worth it to apply for a lien waiver, whether you want to keep the property or whether you want to sell the property. It's a good process. Well, it is a process that you can go through. And it's something that we as a city would much rather do that and get a private transfer to happen than to have to spend money on a foreclosure.
Okay, great. There's a question here that's kind of related to the concern that some people have expressed that, sometimes, there's a perception, whether it's true or not, that well-funded business owners will come in and buy up a lot of properties, right, and sort of monopolize neighborhoods, and they get these prices, these properties from the land bank at very low prices. And so there's a question that says, why isn't there greater support for regular citizens to improve properties, or for modest wage earners to purchase homes for $1, rather than primarily wealthy business interests and purchasers of, outside said neighborhood?
I think that there are a lot of myths out there about a lot of things, about vacant properties, about the land bank. And so I'll take a minute to say a couple of things. But I will preface all of this by saying that we are continuously looking to improve the way that we can use our land bank to meet other neighborhood goals, like increasing homeownership, turning renters in the neighborhoods into homeowners. Increasing affordable housing. Sometimes those, sometimes in the Venn diagram, those overlap and sometimes they don't. But I will say that, with the land bank sales, and that's why one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight quite a few of the different types of sales that we have. We do have a lot of people from the neighborhood who are purchasing properties, whether they be a vacant lot that they just want for themselves, or whether it's a property to rehab. We have a ton of small developers, I would call them kind of neighborhood-based developers, not the big companies who buy one house at a time, buy a house, rehab it, sell it, use that capital to buy the next house, rehab it, sell it. And the property prices, I didn't go over that, but our property prices are pretty low. All of those last look prices are $1. Now you've got to show that you've got the funds to rehab, the structure. And even with our RFP, or request for proposals program, I mean, a lot of times those are going for 2,000 or under for the properties. I was trying to think, I remembered the sales price of, I think it was the first house that I showed, the Russell one, that was the kind of the brick camelback. I think it went for $3,000. So, I think our prices are pretty reasonable, but the issue is a lot bigger than the land bank, frankly, in that we need to get capital to people in the neighborhoods who want to be able to purchase these. Because I mean, the questioner, and we know, is absolutely right in that when people have cash either sitting in their bank account, or their bank ready to write them some sort of financing loan, that's very different than a neighborhood resident that wants to use the house that they're purchasing as collateral. So that's where it's helpful, I think, for us to partner with other city departments, whether it's the Office of Housing or the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or financial institutions, to try to solve that problem.
Yeah, that's, where the collaboration, right? The community collaboration is so critical in this issue, because obviously it's just such a complicated problem. And, one department isn't going to solve the whole thing. So there were a couple of questions here around urban agriculture that I want to get to. One is around, does a purchaser have to buy a vacant structure and build, or can they choose to demo the structure and use a lot for agricultural use? And also there was a question around, do you have like an example, a vacant lot example of of urban agricultural project use?
Sure, we do. I'll take the second one first, but we have certainly sold vacant lots for gardens, whether they're community gardens or market gardens. The Parkland Community Garden is actually owned by the land bank and leased for the community garden use. But there are other examples. There are private gardens, people who have purchased properties to make a garden, whether it's for community purpose or a market purpose. A lot of times our vacant lot programs that we have that are really geared toward neighborhood residents, whether it's the side yard program where you can purchase a lot next door for $1, or cut it, keep it, where you can purchase a lot on the street on the same block for $500. A lot of times we're not asking in our applications what people are going to do with those, but a lot of times I think those are also used for gardens as well. But I know one thing I mentioned earlier, we are really taking a look at our urban agriculture rural programs. It's certainly something that we've looked at in the past. We know that we have sold successfully, or leased successfully and disposed of successfully some properties for gardens, but we know that there's different interest and more interest. So we'd like to really take a look at our policies and see, are we putting up roadblocks or any barriers that we shouldn't be, and what kind of stakeholders can be helping us out with this too. The first question is about someone purchasing a property and demolishing it and then putting up a garden. We do have a program called Demo for Deed. And the issue with that is, or well, it's not the issue, but basically that program is, the city's going to demolish the structure anyway. People didn't want to save it. So if someone is interested, they could demolish it, therefore saving the city demo money, and then have access to the property. That hasn't been very popular for gardens because that demo bill is still pretty high. I mean, it's still, even if you're not the city, it still costs a few $1,000s to demolish a property. So, but it certainly, it's not, I don't think it's anything we would rule out. It's just not been, it's not been really popular, especially when we have a ton of other vacant lots available. I hope that helps answer the questions.
Yeah, I think there's it's obviously a hot issue. A lot of people are really interested in that right now. So yeah, that's helpful. A couple more questions. Hopefully, we're running close on time, but there's one historical question that I'm kind of interested in as well, as around how did JCPS get involved with the Land Bank Authority?
Well, so land banks are, I mean, pretty popular across the country, but it's really, when you think about the main taxing entities, and if you look at your property tax bill, believe me, the JCPS gets the bulk of your property taxes. The city doesn't, and the state doesn't. But that's really what happened is, since property taxes are a main source of revenue for JCPS and the state and the city and the county at that time all got together and decided that they would form a partnership, similar to what other cities were doing across the country, to say, let's work together and get these properties back into tax producing status. And the power that comes with the land bank that's set up by statute and then ordinance and agreement is the power to clean the title. So when the land bank is taking in donations, and the land bank is saying we are essentially exonerating the delinquent taxes, you have to have the three main taxing entities. Otherwise, the city would have to go and request permission from the other taxing entities. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. And so maybe just one final question, and I'm going to try and combine questions as much as I can, because we have a lot, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But please come to the rest of the learning series, and many of these questions will be answered as we move forward. But the question is around, is the city working with small real estate investors who are willing to build and rehab affordable housing? And then I will just sort of combine that. There was a question earlier on about whether there's a partnership specifically with Habitat for Humanity, and the role that they're playing in this.
Absolutely. One of the land bank's policies is that if an applicant is receiving funding through the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, through Metro's housing department, any other Metro kind of affordable housing funding, the properties, the lots are $1. And so that's we work with a ton of smaller real estate investors, whether they're interested in rehabbing or building new. And yes, we absolutely work with Habitat. Actually, the example that I showed, where the Jacobs neighborhood, there was a vacant lot and then there was a house built, that was a Habitat house. So we work with them pretty frequently, along with other nonprofits as well.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm sorry that we are out of time, and there were some questions that we weren't able to get to, but again, please join us for the rest of the learning series. Just a reminder that our next session is on April 20th at 5:30, and we're going to dig into, as Laura had mentioned, code enforcement a little bit more, talk about what code enforcement really kind of looks like in the city, and what resources exist to help homeowners remain in compliance. And I will just put in a final plug to say that sort of related to this, that's also happening in the city right now, are public comments related to the reforms of the Land Development Code that are being accepted right now through the 18th of March. And the Planning Committee is going to be reviewing those recommended reforms and the public comments on March 22nd. So Metropolitan Housing Coalition certainly encourages you to get involved in that. Also very, very important discussion, and have your thoughts heard about the recommended reforms to the Land Development Code. So with that, I will say thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much, Laura, for spending your time and your insights with us tonight. And we look forward to seeing all of you at our future sessions in this learning series.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for setting up the series. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.